I might send me the bills, huh?
The bills.
Bills.
We're the hardy ones. Right, Lenny?
You got it.
Therefore,
We are the ones, right?
Well, we're something.
Okay.
Hey, listen, you know what they say.
Okay, good morning.
Let me see if somebody's coming. Hold on.
Good morning. We're ready to start. Welcome to our continuing series on Mashiach. In our last class, we spoke about preparations. How do we prepare for the coming of Mashiach? How do we prepare for this new age? How do we usher in the final redemption? And we explained that the preparation already began at the beginning of creation. When God created the world, He created it with a plan and a purpose. God said, "Let there be light." That was a mission statement. That the ultimate goal is to bring the divine light into this dark world. The world in Hebrew, olam, means concealed. God's presence was concealed. And it's our task to reintroduce the divine light into this world. So that was set forth at the beginning of creation. At Mount Sinai, God gave us the master plan, how it is that we could generate this light. And with every generation, every century and millennium, we have been getting closer and closer to that time when the divine light will spread itself throughout the entire world, and that would be the coming of Mashiach. That would be the Messianic age. Redemption is likened to a birth, and we are at the end of the 9th month, as it were, and we're waiting for this transition from the period that we call galut, which means exile, into the state of geula, redemption. And all it could take, based on what Maimonides writes, is one mitzvah, one good deed, one divine act to bring us over to the next era. That's all it will take. So everyone has to imagine whenever they're in a situation where they have an opportunity to do a mitzvah or to avoid transgressing, which is also a mitzvah, they should realize that that could be the final act that will bring us over the top. We also discussed how there are specific, any mitzvah would do, no matter what it is. Could be saying good morning to someone to make them feel good, could be that final mitzvah. There are 613 commandments in the Torah. There are so many things that we can do. But there are specific mitzvahs that bring us closer to redemption. They have a certain character that they are suited, more suited than others, to bring about the redemption. For example, the actual feeling of we want Mashiach, yearning for it, asking for it, trusting that it will come, is also what makes it happen. Study of Torah, giving tzedakah, giving charity, these are things that hasten the redemption. Observing of the Shabbat, starting with the lighting of Shabbat candles and all the observances associated with Shabbat. Unconditional love, showing unconditional love to one another. Senseless love, as it's called. And generating feelings of joy, knowing that we're soon going to be transported into a better world here in this physical world. I'm not talking about the afterlife. We're talking about the physical world that will become a world of redemption, a redeemed world, a positive world. So the joy that we should experience, knowing that that's imminent, that itself makes it happen. And also recognizing the miracles that happen every day. Stop looking at the negative as if that defines us. Look at the positive, look at the miracles and praise and thank God, express gratitude to God. These are all things that we discussed last week will hasten the redemption. But I want to look at it from another perspective. The way to transform the world, the macro world and the micro world, is to live, I'm going to use an expression that the Rabbi used, to live with Mashiach. What does that mean, to live with Mashiach? And that means, in very simple terms, to project into the future. How would a perfect world behave? How would the world function in a world that is perfect? And live that way now. In a perfect world, we're not going to fight with others. We're not going to desist from doing a mitzvah because we'll know God's presence is going to be felt, and we won't want to do anything but bringing God joy and satisfaction. We won't want to do anything but being nice to our fellow. In other words, project how a perfect world, a utopian world, would behave, and live that way even now. That is the ultimate way of preparing to the final redemption. There's a model for this way of this approach. When the Jews left Egypt, this is the first liberation, the first redemption, the exodus from Egypt. 49 days, 50 days later, they got the Torah at Mount Sinai. Now we have a mitzvah, there's a commandment in the Torah that's modeled on that, to count the days. So from the second day of Passover until the holiday of Shavuot, we count 49 days, and the 50th day is Shavuot, the anniversary of the giving of the Torah. Now, the Midrash tells us that why do we do this? What's the reason, what's the rationale behind this mitzvah of counting the days? So the Midrash says that this is modeled after what happened at the time of the Exodus. When the people, the children of Israel, were told that they're going to get the Torah, this incredible gift will be given to them, they were so anxious, they were so eager, that they started counting the days. That's why we count as well. But I have a little problem with this explanation. Let's say you know that in 50 days, the person that you really love, a close relative, will come to visit you, that you haven't seen in many years. Or a more mundane benefit, you know, in 50 days you're going to make $100 million. So what do people do? They count down. They say 49 days to go, 48 days to go. They cross it out on their calendar, 48 days to go, 47 days. And they can't wait. How do we count? The opposite. The first day we say today is Yom Echad, is one day. The second day we say today is 2 days. We count in ascending order rather than in descending order. It doesn't seem to fit in with the idea of I'm anxious for that occasion, so I'm counting down the days. No, you're counting up the days. So to answer that question, let me follow another story in the Torah. When Jacob meets his Bashert, the woman that he's going to marry, that he knew he would marry, Rachel, and his future father-in-law Lavan says to him, you can have her, but you have to work for 7 years before you get your wife. And then, of course, after that, he tricked him, and he gave him the wrong wife. He gave him Leah. But later on, a week later, he gave him Rachel. But anyhow, the Torah describes Jacob's feelings for Rachel. And he says that the 7 years were like a few days because of his love for her. Now that's counterintuitive. If you are anxious to marry someone, the love of your life, and you're told you have to wait 7 years, 1 day is an eternity. So 7 years, but he says 7 years were like a few days. You know, it reminds me of the someone at the 50th anniversary of a wedding gets up and he says, my 50 years of marriage with my wife are to me like 2 days. Tisha B'Av and Yom Kippur. The truth is, he could have said Purim and Simchas Torah. But Jacob, to him, 7 years were like a few days. That's counterintuitive. If you love someone and you're so eager to marry them, then each day would be an eternity. 7 years would be impossible to endure. So how do we explain this? And the answer is that when you're dealing with a physical attraction, a physical desire, then the longer it takes for you to get it, the more anxious you become and the more difficult it becomes for you. But when you're dealing with something spiritual, you have a spiritual goal, you don't have to wait 7 years to get it. The very first day of preparing, you already have a piece of it. The very first day that Jacob was counting to marry his beloved Rachel, this was not just a physical desire and a physical attraction. This was a spiritual union. The patriarch and the matriarch of the Jewish people represent the two founders and spiritual fountainheads, you could say, of Judaism and of the Jewish nation. And he was developing a spiritual relationship with Rachel. See, he was a little married to her the very first day he met her. The second day, the marriage got stronger. He was able to connect to her soul, the spiritual dimension of Rachel, even more than the first day. And this kept on growing. Every day, the love got stronger, and his experience of this spiritual union became much more pronounced. And every day was paradise for him. The same thing happened when the Jewish people were yearning to get the Torah at Mount Sinai. They were counting up to it. The first day, they were able to experience a little bit of Sinai, the Sinai experience, if you will. The second day, they were able to feel even more. They had more spirituality. Every day, they were growing in their spiritual lives to the point where they reached the 49th level. They were ready to get the Torah because they had climbed this ladder of spiritual development. That's how we have to look at preparing for the future. Not say, well, it's going to happen tomorrow. Today I can go to sleep. It's going to happen in a year, so I can just do whatever I want. I can forget about what's going to happen in a year, and then in a year I'll wake up and join the new experience. Every day that we wait for Mashiach should be a day in which we bring some of that future into our lives now. We're living Mashiach now. We don't have to wait for something to happen in the future. The future happens right now. And every day we get stronger and stronger in bringing that future into our lives. The Rabbi would tell us repeatedly that we are living on the very threshold of the future redemption. When you're living on the threshold, this means that you, after a long journey, for 3,300 years plus, we've been on a journey, and we're getting closer and closer and closer. And then we finally reach the point where we're standing on the threshold. Now, when you're standing on the threshold, are you closer to your destination or further away? That's a trick question. You have a destination, and you finally reach this house, and you're standing on the threshold. The door is open. Are you closer to your goal or further from your goal? And the answer is, it depends which direction you're facing. If you're facing into the house on which threshold you're standing, then you're very close. Just one more step. But if you're facing the outside, then you're as far away as you can possibly be, because you're looking out. those are two perspectives how we look at the future redemption now. One perspective is that we're standing out on the threshold, so we're already, in a certain sense, in the house, and we're looking in, and we see what's in that house. We see all the furniture there. We see the exquisite decorations and artwork, the tapestries that make this house a palace. So we're standing on the threshold and looking inside. So our whole perspective changes, even though we're not actually in the house, but our perspective is a perspective of what that house is all about. But on the other hand, if you stand on the threshold and you're looking out, then you're not really connecting to that new experience. You're still living in the outside. So you could be inside a house or a situation, and you could be looking out. So no matter how much you're inside, you're seeing things from the outside perspective. Or you could be outside and looking in. That's how we have to determine our course of action today. Do we look at ourselves as that we're living in messianic times, and we're on the threshold, and we're looking in? So we live our lives in a much more sublime way. We live our lives in a much more sophisticated, spiritually speaking, sophisticated way. We live our lives in a messianic way, in a redemptive way, in a joyous way. Or we could be standing on the threshold and stubbornly, because we're Jews, so we're stubborn, and stubbornly we say, we want to see things from the outside. We want to see things from the exile dimension and perspective. And despite what God is showing us, we want to see it from the outside and not recognize the reality of where we are and how our lives are actually changing dramatically. Because of this, what we call the exile mentality, that we sometimes could bring it into our redemption state of existence, is the biggest hurdle that we have to overcome, to get rid of that exile mentality. An exile mentality sometimes has been compared to the Stockholm syndrome. If you remember Patty Hearst and how she was kidnapped, taken hostage, and then she turned into one of her captors. She became a member of the, what was it called? The Liberation Army. Right, something like that. And she became a member, and she was involved in a bank robbery, I think. And what is the psychologists discuss that syndrome? What is it all about? It's that when you are a captive, you suddenly look at your captor as the source of life. That captor could kill you, but he's letting you live. So you look at him, he's my source of life. He is the one who's feeding me. Until you become so beholden to him, or her, for that matter, that you become a member of that group. That's what is happening to many of us in the last moments of exile. That we look at life from the perspective of exile. Who's providing us with everything? The government. Who's protecting us? The police. Who is responsible for our good fortune? We attribute it to all sorts of things, and the one thing we forget is that it's all not the reality. Exile is not reality. Exile is the dream. It's the fake world. The true world, the true existence is redemption. That's the true state of the world. And the exile is there to cover it up, to give us a challenge, to help us stop looking from the inside out, but look from the outside in, so that helps us actually get in. We have to transform our exile mentality and deprogram ourselves. We're programmed by exile conditions, especially considering the fact that there's so much anti-Semitism out there, there's so many negatives in the world, And because of those negatives, we think in dire terms. We think in negative terms. We can't become optimistic. We can't become positive. That's what exile does to us. You know, whenever a person confronts a threat, if you're a healthy person and you're able to run away from it, you run away from it. If someone tells you that there is a dangerous animal lurking outside, you're going to run away and stay in a safe place. There's one type of threat that, unfortunately, the more you are threatened by it, the less you will react to it, and that's a fire. If, God forbid, there's a fire in a home, the people who tragically succumb to the fire die not from the flames, but from the fumes. Well, if the fumes are so terrible, why don't they get out? Because the fumes put you to sleep. So the greater the threat, the greater the resistance to escaping the threat. That's what exile does to us. Exile conditions desensitize us. They're like fumes. They put us to sleep. Yeah, we can be awake and alert, and we can be very productive and everything good, but we're spiritually sleeping. We're in an unconscious state. We're in a comatose state. Because exile is likened to fumes that just puts us to sleep. And the more we are asleep, the less we realize the threat of exile. There's a parable that I once gave to describe what's going on in the last few decades in terms of our preparation for the Messianic age. The parable goes like this. There was a king, very mighty king. The rabbis of the Talmud and Midrash loved to give parables with kings. And I remember hearing once that when they assassinated the Tsar in Russia, a very prestigious rabbi started crying. So they asked him, "Why are you crying?" The Tsar wasn't exactly a good friend of the Jews. You know, people would pray to keep the Tsar far away, of course. So why are you crying for the loss of the Tsar? He says, "I'm not crying for the loss of the Tsar, I'm crying for the loss of the parable." Because the Midrash and the Talmud always use the parable of a king. This can be likened to a king, but if there are no more kings, we lost that parable. So I'm going to retrieve that parable of a king who decides that he wants to entertain himself, so he has this contest, and in order to win the prize, you had to achieve whatever it was in this contest. And all the applicants, when they realized the danger that was involved in this contest, they all bowed out. They said, "No, this is not for me. I'm not going to do this." You know, they tell a story of another story of a king who said, "Whoever could swim across this river will be my son-in-law, will marry the princess." And when everyone saw what was in the river, the crocodiles in the river and the poisonous snakes and everything, no one was willing to sacrifice his life to get the princess. And all of a sudden, some older person just jumps in and swims across and makes it. And someone asks him, "How did you do this?" He says, "My question is, who pushed me in?" So everyone was afraid to engage in this contest, except for one contestant, who no one thought was capable of doing it, but someone said, "I'll do it," and he succeeds. So everyone is expecting that the king is going to give him a whole box of treasure, of gold and diamonds and all sorts of treasures, and instead the king just gives him a key. It wasn't even a golden key. It was a metal key and with a little scroll attached to it. And he tells him, your prize is going to come in a long time from now. You're going to have to travel until you reach a certain destination, and there I am building a new palace, the likes of which have never been seen, and you and I will live together in that palace. And this is the key to that palace, and here are the instructions what to do and where to go and how to get to the destination. Well, everyone else was laughing. He says, that's the prize? He risked his life to win this, and he gets the little key with a little scroll. So people were mocking the whole contest. They were mocking this winner. And after a little while, they would get very jealous of this winner. Even though they were mocking him first, they're jealous, so they try to attack him. And then they try to grab the key and steal the key. And then they say, look, we have a better key. We'll give you our key. And this key will be better than the one that the king gave you. Ours is going to be made out of silver, maybe out of gold. But he resists all the threats against his life, all the enticements, and all the pressure that he was getting. And after many, many years of travel, he finally gets close. He could see the palace, the newly constructed palace, over the horizon, and he's excited that he's going to get to this palace when it seems from nowhere some of his adversaries came and they beat him to a pulp and they knocked him out unconscious and left him for dead. After a few days, he awakens from his coma. With the last strength that he had, he sees a little cottage not too far, and he crawls to the cottage. He takes out his key, because the cottage door was locked, and it's lo and behold, the key worked. And he opened up the door, and the cottage was a very cozy place. It had food, it had blankets, it had beds, it had clothing, it had bandages, and he nurses himself back to health, and he's delighted. It's a wonderful cottage. The view was nice. He could see the palace over the horizon, and he's happy. And he's there for who knows how long, until the king's general or prime minister, whoever was the second in command, knocks on the door, and he opens up, and the king's minister says to him, "What are you doing here?" He says, "What do you mean, what am I doing? The key worked, and it's a wonderful place." And he says, "But this is not the goal. The goal is for you to go to make the last final trek to get into the palace and to live with the king. And come with me. This is your destiny." We are the winner. God took the Torah, the Midrash tells us, and offered it to all the nations of the world. And they all said, no, it's not for us. We can't meet the challenge of all the mitzvahs, all the commandments. It's not for us. But the Jewish people said, Nasa v'nishma, we'll take it, and we'll do it, that's it. And what did they get? They got a Torah, the Torah and a key that would finally unlock the palace that would lead us to the Messianic age when we will be together with God in a world, a perfect, ideal world. And as we're trekking through history, we're attacked because of the fact that we won, we were chosen. And they were attacking us physically, they were attacking us spiritually. They said that our teachings are primitive, are outdated. They said we have a better religion. Our religion is better, it's more updated. And give us the key, we'll give you a better key. And then, as we got to the end of this journey, and we can see the Messianic age over the horizon, we are mercilessly beaten to a pulp during the Holocaust. Never before had we experienced such brutality against us and such destruction, such devastation. And after the Holocaust is over, the Jewish people take this key and we find a very cozy cottage, whether it's Israel, whether it's the United States and the rest of the Western world, where Jews found refuge. And we nursed ourselves back to health, we regrouped, and Jewish people are better off today than they ever were in all of history, materially and even spiritually. There's so much good going on in the world. So many people are learning Torah. Hundreds of thousands of Jews are learning Torah as we speak. so many mitzvahs are being done, so we feel comfortable. This exile is not so bad after all. We're not being massacred. We're safe in this country. Yes, there's anti-Semitism. There's even times when terrorists will come into a temple and try to threaten the Jews there. These things happen, but by and large, we don't have to worry every day about our existence, our physical existence or our spiritual existence. So we find that this is a comfortable place for us to stay, and we forget that this is just the last step. And God's infinite kindness, He saw to it that at the end of exile, we shouldn't have to suffer the way we suffered. He's giving us a taste of the future. In fact, we know there's a Jewish tradition that before Shabbat, you're supposed to taste the food that you're going to eat on Shabbat. Well, before the Messianic age, which is called the Shabbat of existence, we're supposed to taste. God gives us a taste of the future. So He performs miracles for us. We had a 6-day war, a phenomenal miracle. We have the collapse of the Soviet Union, a phenomenal miracle. We have Jewish prosperity, phenomenal miracles. That's a taste of the future. So the key works. The key for the future works even now. But it's only a taste, it's only a sample. It's to give us a little bit of a respite from all the pain and suffering so we could regroup and push forward towards the final redemption. So the issue here is, if we live in exile and we have an exile mentality, how do we turn our face around from looking from inside to the outside, instead of that to look on the threshold inside? How do we change our mentality? The Rabbi addressed this several times. And the Rabbi said, primarily by studying Torah, but specifically the parts of the Torah that deal with Mashiach and redemption. And the Rabbi explained why. First of all, the Rabbi didn't have to say this is obvious. The Jewish people are the most educated people in the secular disciplines in this country. But yet the Jewish people are some of the most misinformed people about Judaism. We're dealing with, we have to look at the positive, but we can't forget the negative if we want to change it. You have close to 6 million Jews in America. How many Jews in America are steeped in Jewish knowledge? A very small percentage, unfortunately. A large number, but it's still a small percentage. That's tragic. So to learn Torah is the first order of the day, to learn what the Torah says, that we shouldn't be looking at these concepts as so many Jews do. They look at Mashiach and redemption through Christological eyes. To them, Mashiach is a Christian idea, and they think that Judaism borrowed Mashiach from the Christians when it was the other way around. And our view of Mashiach is totally different from the view of the other religions. So we have to learn what Mashiach is through Jewish eyes, and the Jewish eyes, the prism with which we look at it, is the Torah. And second, if that was first, to dispel misconceptions about Mashiach. Second, to see Mashiach through Jewish eyes. And third, and the most important, and this is what the Rebbe emphasized, Torah knowledge, because it's divine knowledge, has the power to change our nature. You know, if we look at things through a certain perspective, you know, all of us may think we're independent people and we think independently, but we have to realize that we're products of our upbringing. We're products of our parents' ways of behavior. We're products of what our teachers taught us, of what we see on television, what we see in the movies, what books we read. So much of our attitudes are not our attitudes. They're really a collection of different influences. And those influences are hardly ever divine influences. They're usually human, secular influences. So we have to develop a way of looking at things from God's perspective, not from human perspective. Well, how do you get God's perspective? We're not God. And the answer is, He gave us a Torah. Torah is divine wisdom. So when you see things through God's wisdom, it changes your whole way of thinking. You think in a different way. It changes your mindset. Torah, in addition, is the instrument through which God created the world. It says in the Midrash and the Zohar, the principal work of Kabbalah, that just like a builder, before he builds a house, draws up blueprints and follows the blueprints, God too, as a master builder of the universe, created the universe. But what did he use for a blueprint? He used the Torah. The Torah is the blueprint of creation. So if you have the blueprint, then that changes the creation. The blueprint is what determines how creation should follow. When a person has a different mindset, a redemption mindset, it enables us to live with Mashiach. Now, the idea of living with Mashiach means living with a different attitude, with a different way of viewing the world, a different way of viewing your own lives, a different way of viewing the suffering that we may still have, a different way of looking at the good that we have, a different way of looking at each other, a different way of looking at Judaism. Everything is viewed from a different perspective, from a higher perch. You know, if you're in a valley and you want to see what's going on, you have a very limited view. But if you're on the mountaintop and you can look down, you see things from a totally different perspective. And that's what the changed attitude that happens when we study Torah, specifically the parts of Torah that deal with Mashiach, which is what we're doing now. We just have to do more and more of it until it changes our mindset. We just shouldn't put up resistance, because human beings are funny creatures. We could see truth in front of us, and we could, with our stubbornness, say, I refuse to accept the truth. Reminds me of an incident. Professor Emanuel Shochat, he was a Chabad rabbi and professor, brilliant philosopher, and he used to teach philosophy in a college in Toronto. And one of his students said to him, Professor, could you prove to me that God exists and that the Torah is true? And the rabbi professor said, yes, I can prove it to you, but I'll only do it on one condition. If after I prove it to you, and you accept the fact that I proved it to you rationally, if you don't accept it, I don't hold you to anything. But if you will accept it, will you live your life in accordance with the Torah? So she thought a little and she says, I don't want to hear the proof. What does that tell you? That human beings are a very, very stubborn creation. We're afraid of the truth sometimes. And if we see the truth, it's glaring, it's right in front of our eyes, we will say, I don't care about the truth, this is the way I want to behave. So we have to, that's the one thing that we have to do to take away the resistance. And let us be guided by the facts. Let us be guided by truth, not by what we feel is, well, this is the way I lived my life for so many years. How can I change? Why would I don't want to change. It's not comfortable to change. I know it's a challenge. We all have that challenge. But that's really the key. And someone will say, well, isn't that delusional? And some Rabbi once addressed this. Someone told him, you're talking so much about Mashiach, about redemption. Isn't that a dream? And the Rebbe said, with a lot of passion, a lot of emotion, the Rebbe says, Golus, exile is the dream. Exile is not reality. Mashiach is the reality. What does that mean? To imagine that God creates a world and the world defies God. Is that real? Does that make sense? That doesn't make any sense. How could you believe in a God, creates a world, and the world obscures God's existence? It obfuscates. It doesn't allow us to see reality. Reality is when God's presence is taken out of the cover. That's what Mashiach is. Mashiach is not someone waving a magic wand. Mashiach is a person who will lead us to an age when we will see reality without the cover. That's reality. The dream is, it says when the Jews came back from Babylonia, they said, Hayinu kecholmin, we were like in a dream. What's a dream? A dream is where you see things that are inconsistent with reality. And then sometimes they can be contradictory. And in terms of our own lives, one day we are very pious, we do the right thing. The next day we're lazy and we don't do the right thing. And we're not hypocrites. We're in a dream state. We're not in touch with reality, so we can be doing conflicting, contradictory things. And that's reality to us, but that's really not the reality. That's a dream. So let's wake up. That's the challenge. Let's wake up. And as the Rabbi said, the only challenge we have left is to open our eyes. Now, our eyes are wide open, but you don't see reality if you don't recognize that there's something more to what's going on than just the physical vision of things, the physical view of things. It's like the difference between an animal and a human being. An animal could be walking on the ground, has perfect vision, and steps over a $100 bill. Doesn't even think about picking it up. A human being sees a $100 bill, oh sure, he's going to pick it up. Or it could be a little child on the ground, and the animal just tramples the child. Doesn't know there's a difference between a living being and a non-living being. A human being will, of course, recognize that it's a child. We have eyes, but they're not open. We don't see things the way they are in reality. How do we prepare for the Messianic age? By opening our eyes to see reality and to try to live our lives in accordance with that reality. Does it mean we have to do anything different? Anything radical? No, nothing radical. Just live our lives the way God says we should live our lives in the Torah to the best of our ability and not put up obstacles that are not real, that are just created by our own imagination, by our own Yetzer Hara, our own evil impulse, by our own animal souls. Recognize that the world is going to change soon, and let's be part of that change even now. Are there any questions?
I have kind of a, I don't know, this may be a silly question, but given this week's Torah reading and all that, is there any relationship between, like, Moshe is spelled similarly to Moshiach? Is there any relationship between the two words or two names?
The question was asked, is there any relationship between Moshe and Mashiach? They share two letters. Actually, there's a lot of connection between them. Moshe, if you take the word Moshe and you add the word Echad, one, it adds up to Mashiach, 358. What does that mean? Moshe represents Torah. He's the giver of the Torah. If you take the giver of the Torah and you fuse it with this belief and devotion to the oneness of God, that is Mashiach. There's a rabbinic source that says that Moshe is the first redeemer and Moshe will be the final redeemer. Now, Moshe can't be Mashiach because Mashiach can't be a Levi. But it means that the soul of Moses, the spirit of Moses, will permeate Mashiach. Mashiach will be someone who's totally obsessed with the teachings of the Torah. The Torah permeates his whole being. And fused with this belief in and dedication to the oneness of God, that is Mashiach. So it's more than just the fact that they share two letters, but it's because they represent the same ideal. Moshe is the one who started the process. Mashiach will finish the process. Any other questions? Okay, anyone on Zoom who'd like to ask? Okay, everyone should have a good day, and let's hope that Mashiach comes today. And I won't have to be giving lectures on Mashiach. We'll talk about the good old days in exile. We'll reminisce about how we had to, all the difficulties and all the suffering, because Mashiach will be able to give the lectures a lot better than me.